For those of you, the passage may seem just a little bit obscure, but I'm hoping that by the time we're done sharing here this morning, that it'll become maybe something that you feel applies in a particular way to this church at this time. Before I start into the message, just a couple of little preliminary thoughts. By the way, I was at the Alouettes game yesterday too. So I was in one of those loges way up high. One of the people that supplies us at Welcome Hall Mission invited me very graciously to be there. And the general manager of the Alouettes dropped by to say hello. So if you look on my Facebook page, there's a picture of me with Danny. So I got to meet Danny, okay? Doesn't happen every day. I want to thank you for inviting me to come back to this church. I love the opportunity to speak. And you're at a very pivotal time in the history and the development of your church, the calling of a new pastor. And so that's why I had this passage in Nehemiah kind of on my heart. And then you played Blessed Be Your Name, which is my wife's favorite worship song. So I'm all jazzed and ready to go and share a little bit about Nehemiah. So why Nehemiah? What's important about Nehemiah, and where does he fit in the grand scheme of things? I think the key thing to understand about a man like Nehemiah is he was the bridge at the time between the spiritual and the practical. And so one of the observations that I have made about when God moves in an area, when God changes things, is it's not merely a spiritual revival, as important as that is, but there is also the opportunity for a social revival, for a change in the way things get done in the entire ecosystem of a society. We saw that in the passage. If you read carefully in Ezra and Nehemiah, when the people came back from the Babylonian captivity, there were changes that needed to happen. They weren't just spiritual changes. So I think one of the key takeaways that I share with you is that if we want to see a spiritual revival, and I think we all do, there are often practical impediments to that spiritual revival. A good example would be I'm not going to touch on it this week, but Nehemiah gets into the need for fairness in taxation and fairness to the poor. You look in Nehemiah chapter 4 and some of the things that had to happen in order for a spiritual revival to take root. And I think the other thing that we need to recognize is when we move forward in faith, and you folks as a church are seeking to move forward in faith right now, calling a new pastor, there will be practical matters that need to be addressed. And I think one of the messages that's very key in the book of Nehemiah is that the impossible is possible when God is in it. The impossible is possible when God is in it. Do you believe that? Do you agree? Well, I certainly have experienced that. And if you look, the slide that I've got up there, brokenness, restoration, revival. My experience has been that often we want to move from brokenness to revival very quickly, and we skip that middle step. That middle step is really what the book of Nehemiah is all about, because what he had to do was to rebuild an infrastructure that would serve to protect the economic and the spiritual interests of the fledgling town of Jerusalem at the time. And so if we skip the restoration part, if we just try to move directly from brokenness to revival, I think we miss an opportunity. We miss an opportunity that God wants to put in front of us to go through that process, that difficult process of restoration. And that concept works both individually in your life and mine, but it also can work corporately in the context of a church, and more broadly, I believe, in the context of society. The calling that I have as someone who serves in leadership at a downtown mission, or a citywide mission, I guess I should call it these days, is that we work on the restoration of a city. We're trying, our vision is one word: transformation. We're looking to see our city transformed. And so when you do that, you need to go through that difficult part of restoration and not jump strictly from the brokenness that we all sometimes feel in our lives or in our world and move straight towards revival as if God's going to allow us to skip the process and the difficult task of restoring what's in front of us. So you can move to the next slide, the sort of opening sentence in the framework, if you take away nothing else from this little talk this morning, is that I believe that challenges come to instruct. They do not come to obstruct. Challenges are here to instruct us, provided we're willing to learn from them. I've certainly seen people who go through challenges and don't learn a thing. You probably know some people you could think of where that's happened. But where we are open to the work of God in our lives, both individually and corporately, I believe that challenges actually instruct us, they don't obstruct us. And perhaps Nehemiah is a very good case study. It also is a very good case study for where leadership matters. It's very important that all of you be praying for your leadership as you go into this process of interviewing pastors, because leadership really matters. And when you're in the process of calling a pastor, that decision-making, that discernment that's so necessary is incredibly important, because it matters when it comes to the work that this church is called to do, both now and in the future. Well, we heard a little snippet out of Nehemiah, and I got to tell you, this book really lends itself to maybe a 5 or 6 part sermon series. And so we're just going to touch on a little part of it this morning, because I know you don't have all day, right? At some point, I'm going to have to stop talking. But if you can't tell already, I get very excited about leadership when leadership is called to do something that is impossible. Nehemiah managed to get that wall in Jerusalem rebuilt in 52 days. And everybody said it couldn't be done, and nobody had tried it for 80 years. And so inside of 52 days, in the face of a great deal of opposition, with God's help and with good planning, Nehemiah was able to do the impossible. Well, let me give you a little bit of the historical context. You can switch to the next slide. Judah was sent into captivity. I think many of you probably know the story. They were in Babylon. A number of their key people were taken away. And so the city and the whole area, the whole province of Judah, if you will, was subservient to a series of kings and a series of kingdoms that had replaced one another over the course of years. And what happened was, in Zerubbabel, he led about 40,000 people back into the land, and here they were setting up and reestablishing a worship. So Ezra rebuilds the temple, and so the temple that was destroyed in the era of Nebuchadnezzar, it was rebuilt. But Nehemiah then comes along, and Nehemiah hears about the situation, and his job is really to be a project manager, effectively. He's a project manager who recognizes that the spiritual health of the city, the spiritual well-being, is dependent on its security. You see, in that particular era, rebuilding the walls of a city might seem a little, wacky to us today in the context of our 21st century world. We don't usually have walls around cities. Of course, you can go to Quebec City, there is a wall around that city, but we don't usually associate that with economic well-being. Well, in the context of Jerusalem in that era, the need for a wall was incredibly important, because it secured the economic future and the ability of the city to withstand random attacks. If a big army were to come, well, they were going to be in serious trouble because they would be besieged and so on. But what a wall could do was prevent effectively what amounted to random acts of terrorism in that era. And so having the wall around there would secure the economic future, and that's what Nehemiah felt called to do. So if we look at the actual passage, Nehemiah 1:3-4, which is my next slide, we find that he's sitting back, thousands of miles away, and he says, I heard the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now, if you just flip to the next slide, because I think it's important to pay attention to the sequence here. Because I didn't read verse 2, but if you Think about what he does in verse 2 of Nehemiah chapter 1. He inquires of people. He asks. He listens. He wants to understand what the situation is. Then he weeps and fasts. Then he prays. And if you look at the prayer in chapter 1, he prays with real intention. Not one of those prayers that he says, dear God, the walls are broken down and it's in your will, just fix it whatever way. If you read his prayer, he's praying with clear intention. So he's asking God for specific things. And so I always encourage churches as they're out looking for someone who will come and serve as pastor to make sure you pray with intention. Don't just, pray a nebulous prayer that floats up to God. He hears them all, of course. We know that. But pray intentionally. Pray for the decision-making process. Pray for the heart of the person who's going to be called. There's a number of different ways that you can pray. And then he prepares to be prepared. That's the other part, is if you look at what the reason why he was able to rebuild the wall in 52 days, it was because he gained agreement on the part of a whole number of people who were there, including the king of Assyria. So that was a very important element, is to gain the agreement of everybody and to not just listen and ask, not just weep and fast and stop there, not just pray, as important as that is, but also prepare. So there's a preparation process. And that's one of the things that you are clearly going through as a church, is there's a preparation process. There's a transition team in place. What you're doing is you're looking for someone to come here and you're going through a sequence of steps, and that's so important. So and on my next slide, Proverbs 16 verses 1-3, it says, we can make our own plans, but the Lord gives the right answer. The right answer for you, Greenfield Park Baptist Church, is going to come from the Lord. People may be pure in their own eyes, but the Lord examines their motives. Commit your actions to the Lord, and your plans will succeed. So it's all about him. We have to do our part. You see, Nehemiah actually had to do the building and organize the people. There's a part that we have to play. But it's important that our motives be pure and that we commit our actions to the Lord. So the next part, which is interesting because it was part of our reading too, if you flip to the next slide, Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10, what would a story be without a really good villain? Okay, in this case, there's 3 villains in the story. What would Star Wars be without Darth Vader? You need to have a villain. Well, here we've got Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And one of my favorite things, little rabbit trail here for this one, it's not part of my main message, and it's one that I've used before, is if you look at the number of things these guys tried to derail the process, to get people to become discouraged, to outright plan to kill Nehemiah. These guys were doing everything they could. And one of the things that they did was they tried to get him to come to a meeting. Hey, I want you to come to a meeting. And his answer, Nehemiah's answer was, I am doing a very important work. I cannot go to your meeting. And I got to tell you, I've used that line a number of times. If I'll tell you, in the work that I do, if I went to every committee meeting organized by the City of Montreal or the CIUS Centre Sud or the Ministry of Health and Social Services, I would do nothing but spend my life in committee meetings. And so quite often my answer is similar to Nehemiah's answer. I'm very busy. I cannot come to your meeting. And it seems to work okay for me. But I've been inspired over the years by Nehemiah. There's important meetings that we need to go to. And then there's some things that we can just let happen and nothing much is going to change. I was part of one of those meetings a few weeks ago where I felt I had to be there, but it was 2 hours of my life that I'll never get back again. So tell you, round and round in circles, and we never actually concluded on anything. And that's what Nehemiah had to deal with. He had to deal with the fact that opposition is out there. And I would say this to you, we don't go looking for opposition. We don't go looking for obstacles. But wherever it is that we're doing something important, wherever it is that the call of God is clear, I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that we're going to run into some of these challenges. But remember what we said in the beginning. Challenges come to instruct, not to obstruct. So we need to learn from those challenges. Now, what did Nehemiah do? Well, initially, you can flip to the next slide, Nehemiah 2 and 16. The city officials did not know that I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. Well, what was he doing? You can move to my next slide. Why did Nehemiah act like a secret agent? I think he acted a little bit like a secret agent because he knew he needed to keep the opposition guessing. And the principle is if you told 3 people about something, then it's not a secret anymore. I guess if you've told 1 person, it's probably not a secret. But I think what he did was he was reducing the potential for pessimism among the people. Because keep in mind, Nehemiah is coming. He feels like he's got a mission. He feels like God has called him to help rebuild, reestablish this wall around Jerusalem that's going to protect the integrity, not just of the economic system and the social system, but also of the temple, which had been rebuilt. So he's coming to do this. And initially, I think one of the realities is that the people may not have believed that this was possible. After all, it hadn't been done for many years, and nobody really put any real effort towards it. The wall was broken down in a number of different ways. But I think the other reason that he wanted to do this is he wanted to get his own boots on the ground. He didn't send a bunch of people out to do this, but he went himself. And I think, if I can compare that to what you're doing here, I think as part and parcel of the pastoral search process that you are in here in this church, it's really important that you look around in the area and not just have this mindset that when the pastor comes here, that all kinds of magic is going to happen and he's going to do it all. But I think you need to do some things that will prepare you for what is going to happen when that pastor comes. I suspect you're doing that already. Talking to your elders and your leaders, it's important to not just take a step back and say, well, we're going to wait until he comes and then everything will be fine. No, I think you need to be doing some looking around, a little bit like Nehemiah did. And if you look at what he did, you can go to my next slide, Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. I just took a little piece out of that. 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding. So he went out and he went around. And if you go to my next slide, I've pulled out a map of Jerusalem. And this is the sort of thing that he did is he went out, and it says he went out through the valley gate and he went around the various walls and the various installations, the gates, to check them out, to see how things were. And so he didn't just start here. He went all the way around there, past the fountain gate, the water gate, all the way up to the inspection gate to check it out. And look at where are the gaps? What kinds of workers are needed where? And I think one of the lessons that I take away from this little mission that he went on in the dead of night with top secret and nobody noticing is that we need to recognize that whenever God is calling us to do something, resources are always finite. I often hear, I get to visit a lot of churches, and one of the things that I hear quite often is, well, you need to understand we've got limited resources in this church. Well, I don't care how big or small a church is, resources are always limited. But God isn't limited, is he? God isn't limited. And so where the resources are, we just need to figure out how to apply the resources we have to the mission that God has called us to. And so in the case of Nehemiah, he was able to get resources that were adequate from the king that he was serving. Remember, he was the cupbearer to the king. And the question was, well, if I just apply those resources randomly, the wall's not going to get built properly. So what he was doing was seeing where the holes were. Where did he need bricklayers? Where did he need carpenters? Where did he need special types of laborers? Where did he need to put the most of his effort at any one time? And I think that's a very important thing. You can flip to my next slide, I think, because, that's the path that he took. Yes, it shows you the trajectory. But go to the next one, because there are always external realities that we face. It's the big boulder that's in the way of the road. And I think sometimes we see the big boulder, and that seems very, very limiting. It looks, we see that and we go, well, how am I going to get around it? Well, one of the things to recognize is that God's power and God's ability to find solutions is unlimited. We certainly have limited resources. I want to recognize that. We always do. Everywhere you go, you're going to have limited resources, whether you're a big church, a small church, a medium-sized church, resources are going to be limited. But what you do with those resources, how you apply those resources, the decisions that you make in order to use what God has given you to do what he's calling you to do, those are critically important. And I think we need to avoid this possibility of unbelief that often comes with this sense that we have limited resources or that we have limited capacity. If you look at my next slide, my thesis is this, that I think the foundations and walls in the region of Montreal need repair. I think the foundations and walls in Montreal need repair. We're in a period of time, and I don't mean literally the foundations and walls, but we're living in a city at a time when there are a whole pile of needs. And when I say city, I'm referring to the whole region of Montreal, maybe even more broadly than that, because a lot of the people that we see coming into Welcome Hall Mission are people who come from outside of the region of Montreal. They're coming into Montreal to try and find something that they can't find in the region where they are, or even in the country where they are. There's a lot of people who are coming to this area from other countries around the world and looking to find, to develop a better life for their families. And what I don't want to do this morning is suggest that it's your responsibility now as a church to solve all of the problems of Montreal. I'm not saying that, so please don't take that away and say, oh, we had this guy come and speak to us this morning and he told us it's our job to fix the foundations of Montreal. No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that I believe that every local church, including this one, has a particular role to play. It could be in your neighborhood or it could be somewhere else, but you have a role to play in repairing the walls and the foundations of our community and our world. I believe you do. Question is, what is it, where is it, and how are you going to use the resources that God has given you in order to take steps in that direction? Because I think there are opportunities out there. There are opportunities for service and a wide variety of them. It's a big day for us tomorrow at Welcome Hall Mission. We're going to be officially opening our Youth Services Center up in Montreal North, which might just generate a little bit of media coverage. We will see. But that's something that we did. I mean, just to tell you a little bit of the thinking, we had been serving the youth in the downtown core. One of the things that we noticed was the needs were far greater up in Montreal North. And so about 3 years ago, we acquired a building up there. We opened a free grocery store, and we said we're going to open a youth services center, and we prepared to open it in March 2020. Well, you know what happened, right? A little thing called COVID-19. Well, we still managed to get it open, but not officially. So we're going to be opening it officially tomorrow. And that's just one little thing that we're doing, that we're trying to work on with the people who work with us in order to repair some of the walls and foundations, quote unquote, of a borough of the city of Montreal that very badly needs those kinds of services for at-risk youth. It's very important. Now, this church may have a completely different calling than that. You may not be called to go to Montreal North and do something because you're in Greenfield Park. But there are things that are needed on the South Shore. And you know better than I know what some of those needs are. But I believe that God is calling this church, and in fact, every church, to step forward in faith, use the resources that you have, and make sure that you begin to address some of the things that need addressing here in our city, here in our world. And it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the city or the area where you are. You may have a calling related to an international challenge that you see out there. Our whole world is hurting. And I believe God calls us not just to be people who build community and who learn from each other, as important as that is, but God calls us to reach out to our community and to our world. So my next slide, it says, recognize the opportunity. What could Nehemiah do? What was his ability? Well, he could assess, he could plan, he could mobilize, he could inspire. But then there's a dimension of what only God can do. And so as important as it is for us to step out and to not ignore the calling of God in our lives, we need to recognize that we have our part, but God has a much bigger part. And to the extent that we do what God is calling us to do, God steps in and he does way more than we can ask or think. You agree with that? See, that's what it's all about. See, God could change the things that Nehemiah couldn't control. God was able to protect that group of people from the attack of the enemy. I think probably he just had them confused, and because there were three of them, they probably were not competent enough to coordinate their attacks or something. I'm not sure how it worked, but in 52 days, that wall got rebuilt, and these people sort of sat around and said, how do we let that happen? But it did, and that was what God was able to do. And so here's some questions for us to ponder on my next slide. When God's mission intersects with our responsibility, questions would be, what role are we called to play in the transformation of our community? What's your role? I'm not suggesting that you need to answer it today. Do we understand the needs and the resources required to address them? And this is something that I think as you prepare for a pastor to come here, those are questions that you can be asking yourselves. And then how can we respond effectively? Because it's one thing to be able to understand what the challenges might be or what the needs are, and the needs are great, but what's the most effective way of responding? And I think those are questions that are worth asking ourselves. So as I'm closing up here, let me just go to my next slide for the fun of it. You can pray, and I think prayer is important. That was encouraged a number of times. You can assess the situation. I think that's important, and that can be done in concert with the call of a new pastor. But then you can also act, and acting becomes important. You see, God does have a specific role for your church to play. It isn't just the job of a new pastor to come and do. But the other thing is recognize the obstacles. And that's one of the takeaways that I'd like you to consider is, remember, the challenges we face come to instruct, right? Not to obstruct. Don't be paralyzed. There might be multiple challenges. There might be challenges with the level of resources that you have. There might be challenges with the number of people you can deploy. The problems or the difficulties that you encounter might be great. But if you recognize those obstacles and let them instruct you rather than obstruct, if you don't become stalled or you don't become paralyzed by the things that face us, I think God has a grand mission for you as an individual as well as for this church in fulfilling the calling that he has, which is pretty unique. Every individual local church that I've ever had the privilege of being in does have its own unique characteristics, and I believe its unique calling, and perhaps even a unique way of impacting its neighborhood and its world. And so it's just a matter of recognizing that. You can go to my next slide. This is my final question. If not you, then who? And if not now, then when? God is calling all of us, isn't he? Not just calling me, he's calling you, he's calling all of us. He's calling those of you watching on Zoom. But I think there's that special call. Good thing to pray about it, good thing to listen, good thing to assess, but he's also looking for us to act. And so you're in a unique position here in this church where you're very close to calling a new pastor. But my encouragement, and I've been able to speak, I had the privilege of speaking in a number of churches where they were in the same stage of a process as you are. My encouragement is this: don't just sit back and expect that the new pastor is going to do it all. I think we all have this responsibility to do things together. And there's things that you can do that will prepare the ground for this new pastor when God chooses to call him to come to your church. So I want to thank you for being such a kind and generous audience, for not throwing any tomatoes, at least none that hit me. And look, I believe I'm coming back sometime in December, so I look forward to speaking with you in the very near future again in a completely different context. We'll talk about Christmas when I'm back here in December. So back over to the worship team.